Welcome back to the Bitcoin Treasuries podcast. I'm Tim Kotzman here with Brian Brookshire. How are you doing today?
Doing very good. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us. Your online profile says that you're an MSTR bull, Bitcoin advocate for Bitcoin adoption, and Stanford alum. Do you want to touch a little bit on your background and kind of leading up to your journey to Bitcoin and everything else we have going now?
Sure. I mean, my professional background is I tend to not put it on the Twitter profile just because it's not Bitcoin related. But I came up through ad tech and did a lot, primarily promoting financial products, especially comparison shopping services for pretty much anything with a rate attached to it. CDs, mortgages, credit cards, pretty much any kind of consumer banking product you can think of that I've built a comparison shopping service for. But about 7 years ago, 2017, fell down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. I was, I had kind of an Austrian economics, free markets, hard money advocacy type of background to start with. And so when I learned about Bitcoin, just, ideologically, it just hit me right in the sweet spot. And, I think what was probably like most people is thought, okay, this is a great idea, but can this really, go the distance? Can this go mainstream? Mm-hmm. And I think it's still an open question, but I'm still very hopeful on it. 7 years later, still very interested, and also spent a lot of time researching the leveraged Bitcoin equities, as they've recently been termed. Especially our favorite one, Microstrategy.
And how did strategy first come across your desk? Was it the price action? Was it some conversation online? Was it something else?
Sure. I just I saw it show up on just people talking about it on podcasts. Okay. Probably in 2020, 2021 or thereabouts. Just heard people talking about it. Word on the street was this guy named Michael Semler was taking out a bunch of debt to buy Bitcoin with. And so, I just started noodling on it and just was trying to figure out just how it worked. And I think like most people, I didn't come from a finance background. I'd never heard of a convertible bond before I started researching MicroStrategy. And then just started digging into it, because I think one of the first questions that comes up when you look at strategy is, okay, so, they're taking on debt to buy Bitcoin, but the way they're paying off that debt is by issuing shares. So do shareholders actually come out ahead on that? Mm-hmm. And if what the convertible bond amounts to is selling shares to buy Bitcoin, why not just sell shares to start with? What's the point of the convertible bond? And when you do the math on it, you see, the shares traded at a premium. Convertible bonds are, are premium on top of that premium. And, instead of selling, if you just sold shares, maybe you could sell, share value of, $1 worth of Bitcoin for $2 and buy $2 of Bitcoin. Instead with the convertible bond, you could sell that same, $1 worth of Bitcoin exposure and buy $3 with it. And so, when you chart it out, you can see Bitcoin per share steadily going up over time. And it just made a whole lot of sense as a way to increase Bitcoin exposure in a vehicle where, unlike an ETF, you're not paying a management fee for it. Mm-hmm. And you've got basically a whole treasury team over there at Strategy who's doing a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And so that was really appealing to me.
Recently, you posted that, in essence, this price action down into the 80s and even the high 70s was not, let me look here. Saylor didn't miss a sale because it wasn't for him, and kind of talking about mNAV. Can you unpack that? And then maybe separately, what's your take on mNAV in like the near term, medium term, and then like, does it look a lot different potentially longer term if you kind of get into a second phase of strategy, if that makes any sense?
Sure. Yeah. I think one of the most common criticisms of Semler is that he's always buying the top and he's always like not buying the dips. Mm-hmm. And, just normal kind of common wisdom says, well, you're supposed to buy low and sell high, but he appears to be only buying high. So what's up with that? And the answer to that, I think, goes back to what I was just talking about with the premiums. That we call it the mNAV. Basically the multiple the shares trade at versus their underlying Bitcoin value. The way that moves is that it goes up. That multiple expands on average. It expands when Bitcoin is going up, and it contracts when Bitcoin is going down. And so that spread, the spread between the underlying Bitcoin value of the shares and the share price, that's the premium that he's able to capture and convert into more Bitcoin per share. And so it's, the counterintuitive part about that is it makes more sense to do this at Bitcoin tops. It makes less sense to do this at Bitcoin bottoms, just because the purchasing power has an inverse relationship with Bitcoin price. And so, basically every time this comes up, people say, oh, why didn't he buy the bottom? Well, it's because, mNAV was low. The arbitrage purchasing power was low. So that's, it's not the time to do it. You do it when Bitcoin is spiking.
Would it be fair to say that is when the price of Bitcoin goes down, their leverage ratio also shoots up? So if your leverage ratio goes from a 12 or a 15 to a 22, maybe the last thing you want to do is like take on additional convertible debt that like gets you near where you say you're comfortable, 30%, right? 20 to 30% leverage ratio, or is there anything I'm missing there?
Yeah, that's also true. Just where they're at right now, last time I ran the numbers, their leverage ratio is around 20%, a little under 20%. He says his target's 20 to 30%. So, they still got some room to run. But on top of the premium being low, you've also got IV is pumped up a little bit just because we've had some volatility lately, but we've been through this long period of declining volatility. And so low Bitcoin price, low mNAV, plus low volatility kind of makes for a cocktail of it being not a great time to issue convertible debt. The magic formula for good convertible bond pricing is high volatility, high mNAV. So you really want things to be going the other direction when you're issuing those convertible bonds. And I mean, like the best example of that was last November. People say I can't time markets, but look at November 21st. Look at the Microstrategy price. Look at the implied volatility. Look at mNAV on that date, and he nailed the Pico top almost as perfectly as he could with that convertible bond.
If you had to guess moving forward, is it like a few months of like a lot of volatility and price action, and then this kind of desert of like 2, 3, 4 months of declining volatility? Or could we get into like faster volatility cycles, if that's a decent way of framing it? Or do you see it some other way?
Yeah, well, just the price action for the past year is kind of been like, the earlier scenario where we get, this few days where Bitcoin just shoots up wildly and then like plateaus, and then shoots up wildly and plateaus. And those are the times where Semler's really been able to capitalize on the volatility, is right doing those Bitcoin price spikes. Because you can't, people talk about how, he's trying to engineer volatility into the stock, but still, it really rides on the back of Bitcoin volatility. If you don't have Bitcoin volatility, you don't have MicroStrategy volatility.
Got it.
So, and I think that's just really what it is. During those windows when Bitcoin is really moving, that's the time to capitalize. And like I said, this past year, that's kind of what it's been like. Up real fast for a week, maybe 2, and then flat. And historically, it's not always been quite exactly like that, but you tend to have a lot of the price action happen on just a few days. So that, in terms of whether that will change, I kind of don't think that it will. I think that's probably what it'll look like, but like anything, you can just kind of have to watch the charts and see what happens.
Yeah. Hey guys, this episode is brought to you by OnRamp. Bitcoin custody is evolving. Both self-custody and single third-party custody come with significant risks and trade-offs. OnRamp is pioneering a new standard, multi-institution custody, which eliminates single points of failure, adding fault tolerance and redundancy to your setup. OnRamp secures your Bitcoin in a segregated, cold storage, multi-sig vault, guarded by 3 independent, institutional-grade custodians, none of which have unilateral control. Multi-institution custody removes the technical, mental, and physical burdens of private key management, providing unparalleled peace of mind for you and your loved ones. To learn more, schedule a consultation with the OnRamp team. Go to www.onrampbitcoin.com. How would you describe the price action very recently, but also, maybe zooming out a little bit, because do you view it as like the news creates the narrative and then it's like Bybit hack, reserve, tariffs, reserve. It's just like it seems to be whipsawing quite a bit, especially over the last couple of days. I guess, how do you think about all of that?
Yeah, obviously we're definitely reacting to the news here. My take is that broadly the bigger trend is that we're following macro, and until we get something like I don't think QE is probably not coming this year, but just like ending QT, getting back into a rate cut cycle, probably something of that nature is what it would take to really start getting another sustainable move up. I think a lot of the whipsawing that we're seeing is because it's news driven, but it's not really fundamentals driven. Mm-hmm. Like if you look at the big move we saw yesterday, there was an announcement about strategic crypto reserve, but then the move completely retraced today. And so I don't think just having these news announcements is going to be enough for a sustainable pump. We're going to have some more kind of solid fundamentals backing the move up. We're going to need more large buyers than Michael Saylor. I mean, it's awesome to have him buying Bitcoin, but we're going to need more large players.
Right.
And that's kind of how I see it.
How do you think through the reserve and the fact that I think we have until July 22nd to get the working group's recommendations on the president's desk? And then in a separate bucket, you have an executive order for a sovereign wealth fund. Based on Saylor's most recent interview, his opinion at least is that it sounds like he would prefer Bitcoin to be in the reserve and then maybe Bitcoin and other digital assets in a sovereign wealth fund. Of course, that's just one person's opinion, an influential person's opinion. How do you think through all of that, and what's your take on, there is the exchange stabilization fund, which the executive branch, the president, could be, however they would go about it, buying up to $40 billion worth of Bitcoin and not announcing it beforehand. Do you think that's happening? Or, without getting into conspiracy theory land, but there are certain things that are in play that sure. Governments do all sorts of things all the times for different reasons of national, security, strategic security interests, however you want to phrase it. So I don't know. Sometimes I let my mind run wild, but maybe I shouldn't.
Well, I think I've been letting my mind run a little bit wild on this too. And just watching what happened the past 24 hours, it makes me wonder if you're really concerned about we're starting a sovereign wealth fund for America and our goal is maximizing ROI, you probably wouldn't announce it that way. Like people say, you'd be quiet about it, you try to accumulate and then announce afterwards. And it's possible that they can't do that just because of the way government is. There's a certain amount of transparency that they have to have in order to do anything. But it makes me wonder if the goal of crypto reserve, if the goal of sovereign wealth fund, if the goal of the government, the Trump administration particularly standing behind crypto, is it really to have a fund for the prosperity of America, or is this just a success metric for the administration? If it's a success metric for the administration, then the actions that the administration take might look very different. It could take for example, take the form of just announcing something, talking about it, putting very minimal effort into actually executing the reserve, trying to talk the market into doing most of the work for him, and then sort of helping out, for lack of a better phrase, the crypto backers that help put him in office. So I think it's going to be difficult for him to move the stock market. Like Trump policies of the next year are probably going to have a difficult time moving the stock market. So it presents, crypto presents a smaller target, easier target to move. And so, keeping the crypto crowd happy could be something that he tries to tackle. And the actions he takes to do that might look different than what he was doing if the goal was really to establish a crypto reserve with the goal of maximizing ROI.
Got it.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. What's your take on all of the states with this legislation? Maybe we'll get one or two or a few this year, but I was listening to a Spaces a few days ago, and there is that game theory that once one state adopts a strategic reserve at the state level, then that's kind of cover for more states. But yeah, do you buy into that theory or not so much?
I still think it's possible. In general, I'm not super bullish on the reserves because I think it's just going to be very difficult to get them through, both at the state level and at the national level. Like the Loomis bill, I think is going to have a very hard time getting through Congress. But at the state level, I think it's conceivable we could still get one or two. Like Texas and Florida, I think, in my opinion, have the best chances of actually getting through. Not slam dunks, but actual like realistic possibilities. But I have a hard time seeing it being the case that it just kicks off, game theory, and then one or two do it, and all of a sudden every state has a reserve. I think it'll probably look more like 4 years ago when Semler started his Bitcoin Treasury. He thought, okay, well, people thought that a lot more treasuries would pop up right away, and it took about 4 years before Semler and Metaplanet and some other folks started wading into the water and trying the same strategy. Yeah. If we continue to have 4-year Bitcoin cycles, maybe it could look something like that. Maybe 2025, we get one or two states. 4 years later, once that's kind of proved out, and the early adopters have been able to show success with it, then maybe you get something that looks more like the tech adoption curve, where you get the early adopters, then the late majority, or the early majority and the late majority come like way after that.
That makes sense. So leverage Bitcoin equities. Let's take strategy. Can you run through like what are they doing? What are you paying attention to? And like the specific thing that I'm curious about is with the amount of at the money equity they can sell, like their balance that they can raise from the equity ATM along with the convertible bonds. Does it make sense that that's going to kind of take more or less until the next earnings call? Or if it wouldn't, I mean, they can just announce a new capital plan like via tweet and the normal public company channels. But it's like, yeah, I guess I just anchor in my mind that they announced the current 21-21 plan on an earnings call. And so maybe the expectation is that they would do that again, but the next earnings call isn't for a while. How do you, if you could just walk us from the top, from how you view all of it? Sure.
Well, I think they've got about $4 billion left on the ATM and considerably more on the fixed income side of the 21-21 plan. My prediction going back to the beginning of December is that probably we wouldn't see any convertible bonds until after the February 4th, or was it February 5th? Anyway, after that earnings call, probably wouldn't see any convertible bonds till after that earnings call. And then we would see maybe 3 before the end of the quarter. So we've got 1. If they announced 1 this week and 1 more 2 weeks from now, that would get us to my anticipated 3. The price action could be a little bit difficult for us to make that happen. It looked going into this week like the price action might be very favorable for a convertible bond issue this week, but with the the Sunday move like completely retracing today, that changes the picture a little bit. But I think that Semler in an interview in December basically telegraphed, okay, we're transitioning from using the ATM to fixed income instruments, in the first quarter. And I think we're in that phase right now. That if you want to issue those convertible bonds, you want volatility as high as you can possibly get it, which means that you don't want to be in there blunting those tops with ATM selling. So I think probably what we'll see is they alternate back and forth between those. We did see heavy ATM usage at the same time they issued that convertible bond in November, but I think those were special circumstances. We were in a very heated market at the time, which let them do both at the same time. But I think, probably at the end of the quarter, maybe we still see 1 or 2 convertible bonds if they can get the pricing they need to make that happen. After the earnings call, they still have quite a bit of fixed income left they want to issue. But my take on the way MicroStrategy or strategy operates in general is that they're much more opportunistic about the way they do it than people give them credit for. You can't just go out and issue convertible bonds on a fixed schedule. The pricing has to come to you a little bit. The Bitcoin volatility has to be there. You can't just manufacture it from sawdust. So, and I think that's what really remains to be seen. It could be, if Bitcoin is quiet, then MicroStrategy could be quiet for a while. But if we see that volatility pick back up again, if we see Bitcoin price running again, then we could see strategy getting very, very active back in the capital markets with new fundraisers.
Got it. And any opinions, hot takes, comments, how you view Semler, Metaplanet, and any others that you care to mention on down the list? Sure.
Like Metaplanet has done a fantastic job. I think they saw it's like 4,700% return in 2024. Dylan LeClaire has done an absolute amazing job with their Bitcoin strategy. Eric Semler over at Semler Scientific, I think I wasn't so sure about them at first. Wasn't sure how committed they were to the strategy. The first 2 interviews that came out with them, he was very cagey about it. But he's really opened up, and I think they are committed to the strategy. They did their first convertible bond, I want to say 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I think they're going to keep plugging away. I don't see any reason why they would stop. And I'm very excited where they're headed. There's another one that just got started 2 weeks ago. It's called HK Asia Holdings. It's a Hong Kong company that was their Bitcoinization, if you can call it that, is being spearheaded by the same investors that backed Metaplanet. So if they can replicate success there, that would be very interesting.
And what do you expect through, let's say, the next couple of quarters, the end of 2025, as far as additional announcements on leveraged Bitcoin equities, Bitcoin Treasury companies, whatever term of phrase, as far as do you expect it to be mostly US based, kind of more all around the world, maybe a combination of half public companies adopting the strategy and half private companies flipping public? Any thoughts there?
I think there's a lot of credibility to the idea of starting one of these in other major markets, just because you've got a different pool of captive buyers that have got limited access to Bitcoin exposure. The way things are going to play out in the U.S., I think, there's this concept called positioning and marketing. And the way markets tend to shake out is you tend to get 1 or 2 big players, and then the number 3rd player is way off in the distance. So you can think of Coke versus Pepsi, and then the number 3 person being RC Cola. like much smaller market share. And so the situation right now is there isn't really a strong number two. There's strategy way out in front.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so it's more like we have like Coke in front, and then we've got RC Cola on the side.
Okay. Yep.
So, and there's a real question as to whether or not anybody can really come anywhere near a strategy unless a bigger company gets involved. The way it could play out is that instead of having like one or two big players, we could have just strategy up front and then a bunch of smaller players involved. And I think that the way it'll probably shake out is that a lot of people will try it and then some people will abandon it.
Mm-hmm.
And so there'll be this creative destruction of companies trying it, and then there being like a few big winners, and then probably a lot of companies that tried it and then said, maybe this isn't for us.
Yeah. What do you think the chances are that Semler could be that Pepsi, as far as like if they get some additional products on their operating line kind of out in the market, or one in particular, like could that kind of become this growth company that Ben Workman always loves to talk about? I want to see a growth company adopt and kind of like just see very positive things from that, or do you think that's maybe overstated?
I think they have of the people who are actively in the market right now, I think they have the best chance of anybody. I think what's going to be difficult is just the pace at which Bitcoin grows. If Bitcoin keeps appreciating in price at these massive 4-year leaps, I think just that alone could make it very difficult for anybody of any size to catch up to strategy. But if anybody out there, I do think that Semler has the best chance of taking that number two, Pepsi-like spot. But they will have to execute very well. Have to execute very well and be very disciplined about it. But I think they will probably, even if size-wise they're not, Pepsi in relation to Coke, they could still wind up being, the largest number two player by a wide margin.
How do you think about Bitcoin versus strategy and the other equities? Because the one thing that I like about like the True North group is like a lot of the time they kind of make a point of saying we own Bitcoin, period, and then we own strategy. And I think sometimes the conversation, maybe not recently, but it gets into like, oh, well, you like MicroStrategy and now you don't own any Bitcoin, and so you're not a Bitcoiner, all this stuff. Like, is there a right answer and a wrong answer? Is it a personal decision? Like, should people own both? Of course, like just hypothetically speaking, not financial advice.
Yes, absolutely not financial advice. No, the way I've heard some people put it is, it's the difference between saving and investing. You save in Bitcoin, and then MicroStrategy is an investment. I think that's a reasonable way of looking at it. Because I think the only real investment case that makes any sense to me for a company like MicroStrategy is I want something that's going to outpace Bitcoin returns. And the only strategy that anybody has come up with to do that is to take a company that buys Bitcoin and then buys more Bitcoin. Right. It just keeps adding to their Bitcoin stack. And probably for until we get to a stage where Bitcoin is just money everywhere, and you can actually value a company based off of its forward PE ratio or whatever in Bitcoin terms, that's probably the strategy that's going to stick if you're really interested in investing in a company that's trying to outpace Bitcoin returns.
The Bitcoin for Corporations Conference is coming to Orlando May 6th and 7th. Receive 20% off admission by going to microstrategy.com, selecting Bitcoin for Corporations, and using discount code KOTZ at checkout, and I'll see you there. Hey guys, today's episode is brought to you by Stampseed. If you're in cold storage, you know how important it is to protect your seed phrase. That's why I recommend you head over to stampseed.com and check it out for yourself. This seed phrase storage device is one solid piece of titanium. There are no loose pieces, and you can hammer your seed phrase in letter by letter. When you go to stampseed.com, use promo code TIM15 for a 15% discount across the website. That's TIM15. Do you think this is kind of a in-between or weird time where we're needing to come up with these new metrics of Bitcoin per share and Bitcoin yield and et cetera? Or do you think, what's your take on all of this, especially leading in, like, does this then get us to where an mNAV of 10 or 20 or beyond is actually makes sense, or or is this like a weird metric sort of time that we're living in as far as Bitcoin's concerned?
I think yes and no. I mean, the way I tend to look at mNAV is I think about that being sort of like a PE ratio, but in Bitcoin terms. Mm-hmm. Like, instead of future discounted cash flows, future discounted Bitcoin holdings. So that's the mind space, the way that I hold mNAV in my head. Yeah. And that, if you want to, calculate that out into dollars, well, you can just run the conversion from Bitcoin into dollars, and there's your PE ratio. But I do think we're in this weird kind of intermediate space. Is that, if hyper Bitcoinization happens, if Bitcoin becomes money, if all these things that we think could happen, then you won't be able to run a strategy of borrowing dollars to buy Bitcoin, because there won't be dollars. Mm-hmm. So, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. Maybe optimistically that's 10 to 20 years away. Probably more like 30 to 40 years away, if it ever happens. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a very interesting time when this strategy is actually something that can even be done.
Yeah, that's where my mind went, is like, if mNAV right now is almost like breathing or like an accordion, where when it goes up, then it gives you more room to kind of issue more shares, and it just kind of keeps breathing. Then when we get that 10, 20, 30 years out, is that when, like, in essence, you can't buy that much more, or like any like commercial quantity or large quantity of Bitcoin with USD? Is that when the mNAV maybe runs? Because then people are like, oh man, now I really need to, like, what is the value of this company if, like, none of us can really buy that much Bitcoin with cash anymore? Or how do you think about that?
Well, this might be a contrarian take, hopefully not too bearish of a take, but I think that probably mNAV actually declines slightly over time, because the let's say MicroStrategy, or I'm never going to get used to saying strategy, but let's say strategy wants to buy one Bitcoin today. Well, they can go out and they can sell $100,000 worth of shares to buy that Bitcoin. Let's say the Bitcoin is $1 million. Now the strategy has to go and sell $1 million worth of shares to buy that Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. That's a lot more capital to move. Mm-hmm. And it's just from a raw ability of the market to be able to absorb that amount of share sales. It's much more difficult to move that kind of capital, and it's going to be, and it will slow down the growth, assuming that the only strategy that they're employing is, capital markets arbitrage like they're doing today. But is that going to be MicroStrategy, or is that going to be Strategy's business model forever? Who knows? Maybe someday they're operating more like an investment bank, or maybe someday more like a consumer bank. In that case, things could look very different. If they're a company that has much larger cash flows, those cash flows are coming in Bitcoin terms. Maybe that's when we see it being valued more like a traditional company being valued on its cash flows. I don't think that you get to a point where it's valued just based on cash flows while the strategy is primarily capital markets arbitrage. I think that's a difficult sell. But if it does get to a state later on where it's more like that investment bank or commercial bank where there's other lines of business, then maybe that's when you could potentially see, the mNAV really run, because then it's not just like, we're going to buy more Bitcoin. It's like we actually have this really strong business behind it, and that's got a lot of value to it.
Yeah, I guess it kind of sounds like no matter how much Bitcoin is adopted, a lot of people, because investors are just people inside institutions or retail, et cetera, that it's always going to be easier to wrap your mind around quote unquote actual business with actual operations and business lines and products and services. Do you think that's a fair statement? Or
I think it's a fair statement. I think the other thing to point out is I think I think a common misconception about strategy is that the only way that it outperforms Bitcoin is if that multiple keeps hitting new higher highs. And that's just not true, because they're buying Bitcoin. If mNAV is the multiple on NAV, the thing that you're taking the multiple of, the NAV is increasing. So, as long as that keeps going up, if mNAV is flat even, or doesn't do anything interesting, as long as that NAV keeps going up, then, MicroStrategy's got room to run.
That makes sense. What are the obvious business lines in the future? You mentioned like an investment bank or a consumer bank. Is it insurance? Are there like 2 or 3 other like obvious things or not so obvious things that we can go into conspiracy theory land and think like this, like they could do lots of things, but what are the top ones, I guess?
It's tough to say exactly what the products would be, but I think the kinds of things that would be, like if you look at what they're doing right now, for a long time, basically they had one strategy, convertible bonds, and then, also ATM share selling. But recently they came out with a preferred stock. And if you come from a more like traditional product background, then you're thinking, okay, well, that is going after a different segment of target buyers. Mm-hmm. So is there a different way they can package Bitcoin exposure to appeal to, a different segment of buyers? I'm not exactly sure who that would be within, the various capital markets teams, but if there's another way they can package it up to sell to people with, different risk appetite, different, exposure preferences, there's different ways they can do that. I think the move to something that looks more like consumer banking is probably harder, because if you're going to take out a loan denominated in Bitcoin today to buy a house, that would be like economic suicide. You just couldn't do it. The Bitcoin would appreciate far more rapidly than the house. So, but that won't always be the case, right? Bitcoin's not going to be a 30% CAGR forever. There's going to come a time, maybe not today, maybe not 10 or even 20 years from now, where that CAGR is more like 5% a year. And when you get to that point, that's when a Bitcoin denominated loan could make sense. And I think that the kind of inflection point comes when, because if you think about, if I'm going to loan Bitcoin, what is that person going to do with it that's either profitable, makes sense for them? Well, whatever return they're going to get on that Bitcoin has to match the return of Bitcoin, plus say 5%, or else it doesn't make any sense. And so, right now, probably the really only purpose for lending Bitcoin would be like, somebody, shorting it or trading it. But once lending Bitcoin is more feasible for, a broader range of economic transactions, then potentially, Bitcoin lending becomes, an interesting business idea. So that's, basically that's the way I see it is, approximately looking for different categories of buyers within capital markets to package up Bitcoin exposure in different ways. And then longer term, potentially different ways of lending Bitcoin to, buyers of different, to borrowers of different types.
I guess that makes sense. If your hurdle rate is Bitcoin, then it becomes easier to lend as the CAGR goes down.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if you borrow money today, let's say if you're a business and you want to borrow it today, well, your business has to at least be performing 30% per year. That's pretty stiff.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be done, but that it's high to demand that year in and year out. But as it goes down, it's going to become an easier hurdle rate to clear over time.
Where do you think we are with individual adoption? Maybe I misheard you, but almost like the consumer bank might be tough. Reminded me, if that's what you said, of I just feel like there's a real chance that like strategies in the QQQ now, right? They may be in the S&P 500 in the future. And so people's retirement accounts, they just, whether they know it or not, they have exposure to Bitcoin. But maybe there's this middle age, no pun intended, of like people in their, like not people in their teens or 20s, but like 30s or more so 40s, 50s, 60s, where they're just like, I don't want, they're closed-minded, or they just are kind of not going to ever learn about it. And it's more of this institutional and nation state push. Do you think that's fair, or kind of not giving enough credit to the power of kind of individuals educating more individuals?
Sure. Well, there's two different mental models that can wrap around that. The first one, I think that probably every cohort of adopters, at least to my view, it looks like it's grassroots pretty much for every different cohort of adopters.
Mm-hmm.
For individuals, it started off with just cypherpunks, and eventually moved its way up to larger and larger pools of capital, larger investors, bigger whales. And then within, institutions, it started off with, when Strategy started buying, they were a smaller company. I think they were, somewhere like $2 billion market caps, somewhere in that order of magnitude. It was smaller companies who'd appealed to first. Tesla's a bit of an outlier. They took a position, the only Mag 7 company to do so far. Probably the rest of the Mag 7 will be the last companies to put Bitcoin in their balance sheets. Governments, El Salvador, Bhutan, some of these smaller countries looking to improve their financial standing, they're first. And it's one reason I'm a little bit skeptical about the US really getting off the ground with Bitcoin, because it kind of inverts the order. But the general trend will probably be smaller countries first, larger countries later. And I think that's it's going to happen across all different cohorts of buyers. And the second way I look at it is that within tech marketing, there's this concept called crossing the chasm, and it's basically this model of the way new technology is adopted. And in the beginning, you've got the innovators, which are basically like the people who are super early. This is like people who were in Bitcoin in like 2012, or like maybe like prior to 2012, like Satoshi, Hal Finney, and the super early people. Then you get the early adopters. I still kind of think we're in that early adopter phase right now. They're the people who are kind of willing to put up with the rough edges of the technology to use it just because it's early and they think it's a good idea. And then after that, you get the early majority. That if you think of a bell curve, this is kind of like a big chunk of the middle portion of the bell curve. I think probably what early majority looks like is, it's like that situation you described where more and more people are exposed to it where they don't even know it.
Mm-hmm.
It's in their retirement accounts, it's in their index funds. Maybe they start just having an allocation from their financial advisors. Maybe it just becomes like a standard allocation. And then the target that I always had in mind for late majority is if you think about the way personal finance is today, like if you pick up any personal finance book written in the past probably 25 years, the advice is basically, DCA into S&P 500 index fund over a lifetime, and that's it. That's the whole financial plan. Mm-hmm. So the late majority adoption phase could be like, well, maybe instead of DCAing into S&P 500 over a lifetime, maybe you're DCAing into Bitcoin over a lifetime. Mm-hmm. And then for the last category in that model is the laggards. Those are the people who just kind of never really get there. Yeah. But by the time you've captured up to the late majority, you've already got over 90% of people. So that's what I have in mind for what the overall trajectory could look like.
Got it. What's your take on Elon? Like first with Tesla, like they put Bitcoin, as you said, on their balance sheet several years ago. I believe it was 2021. And they sold some, and it was to test liquidity and all this stuff, and they accepted it for payments, and they didn't accept it for payments, and that crashed the price. All this stuff that happened, but they've kept it on the balance sheet. If you want to dive into anything like operationally with Tesla that you think with everything being computerized and AI this and something else that, but then also, and of course he's a showman, he's the meme lord and all this stuff. But I don't know. My conspiracy theory is that like he's the Doge father, and there's so much like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Doge, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Doge. It's like Doge to like almost distract away from like Bitcoin. Do you share any of that view, or am I just off in my own space?
Well, so this might not be the most flattering comparison, but the way I always think about it in mind is that if Elon Musk was a hot girl, Bitcoin is in the friend zone.
Yes.
He kind of comes by once in a while to play with his feelings and then goes away. So I just think that he's so focused on executing on his companies and all of his projects that he doesn't really have time to think about Bitcoin. The fact that it's still on his books, I think that maybe it's not a huge message, but is perhaps a little message. He probably thinks there's something there, but I just think he's just so busy, with trying to build rockets to Mars and self-driving cars and all these things that, Bitcoin is just, it's at the back of his priorities.
Yeah. How do you approach social media and the mindset that you go in with, and like any resources that you use that you either recommend to other people or you're just using every day that you think might be helpful for other people for you to give a shout out to? Yeah.
Social media. Yeah. I mean, Twitter is really the only social media that I use. I go on and try to find accounts that are saying intelligent things and that give me insights, and try to join the conversation where I can. And I think it's one of the amazing things about X is that you can go on and people will answer your questions. You can go in and you can ask people who would not give you the time of day in real life, but you ask them a question on X and you'll get a response a lot of the time. So I think just curate your follows wisely and ask questions when you have them, and I think it's a tremendous resource.
Absolutely. Where can people find you on X and anywhere else that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, so I'm Bitcoin Overflow on X. It's BTC_overflow. That is really the only place to find me on social media. So if you want to stop by and drop comments on my posts, I will most likely answer your questions.
Awesome. I'll throw it over to you for any final thoughts, and appreciate you making the time today.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on the show. To say, I think that even though the Bitcoin times are a little bit challenging right now, I still think we're having a great second half of the year. That's kind of where I'm looking to. I think that there's macro headwinds right now. I think that things will look much better in the second half of the year. So I'm still very excited about that. Very bullish on all the things that Strategy and the other leveraged Bitcoin equities are up to. I expect them to have good years. So that's how I see it, and that's what I'm hopeful for.
Awesome. Well, appreciate the time, and we'll chat soon.
All right. Thanks for having me on, Tim.